I'm Michael. Welcome to Beyond the Screenplay, the podcast where each episode we do a conversational deep dive analysis into a film. Today we're talking about The Brutalist, the 2024 film written by Brady Corbet and Mona Fastvold, directed by Brady Corbet. I'm joined by the Beyond the Screenplay team, Trisha Rand.
Hello, everyone.
Brian Bittner.
Hello, but with an intermission between the two.
Nice, yep. And Alex Calleros.
Hi.
So we are in week 5 of our Wicked winter season. It began with Wizard of Oz and Wicked. We talked about Sicario. We talked about Challengers. Last week, we talked about Network, which was super, super fun. That's over on the Beyond Screenplay Patreon. Next week, we're talking about Chicago, again, over on the Beyond Screenplay Patreon. That's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to a lot of different places in this. Chicago is a different movie than The Wizard of Oz, is a different movie than The Brutalist. It's a different movie than Challengers.
They sure are.
Yep.
Different movies here.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting season.
The Brutalist was originally going to be a musical, which was weird, but they just cut out all the songs because it was too long.
I could see it. I don't know. Anyway, okay. So, yes, next week we're back with Chicago over on the Beyond Screenplay Patreon. But for now, The Brutalist. So I knew basically nothing at all about this movie going into it, other than it was long, and it is. And I expected more brutalism, honestly. I'm trying to figure out how I feel about this movie because, as we've said, it's long, but at no point, especially in the first half, did I feel like it was dragging. Like things were moving at a slow but like deliberate pace. I was really wrapped up in just the world that was created. It felt so authentic to the time. Like I felt like I was in 40s, 50s Pennsylvania. The performances are really, really good. And I feel like I haven't seen Adrien Brody in anything in a long time. And I was like, you are like, there's just so much. I just want to look at you. Like he's really good. Guy Pearce is really good. All the performances are really good. And yeah, not knowing what the narrative was, I found myself really like sucked in and invested. And the filmmaking is just really interesting. Like I kept trying to figure out like what was like the thinking behind this shot, or more how did you come up with this shot? How did you know to do it this way? Because that is not an obvious choice to the average person. The movie is just like unavoidably good and well made. And I still just don't know how I feel about it. And that's what's so interesting. It's like I enjoyed it. It wasn't fun all the time, but I was entertained. My thoughts were provoked. I was moved. I was intellectually stimulated. The cinematography is gorgeous. Like the movie's just gorgeous. The subject matter is interesting. But I'm left in this weird mental state where everything is just like, I don't know how I feel. So I'm looking forward to talking to you guys and see if I can figure out how I feel. Brian, tell me about The Brutalist.
Well, I have bad news if you were hoping for anything different than exactly what you just said. First of all, I will say that I went to the Alamo Draft House to see this, which, does the food and drinks and everything. We went at 10:30 a.m. on a Sunday.
Smart.
I got the bottomless coffee. My partner got the bottomless Diet Coke. We ordered some snacks in the first half, lunch in the second. I knew that it was basically like 2 hour and 40-minute movies with a 15-minute intermission. I was like, I can do that. I can go to 2 movies. That's easy. And then it was only 2 p.m. when we came out, and we had like the day ahead of us. It was just like, it all made it very, very palatable.
That's the way to do it. Yeah, daytime screening.
As for the movie, I also knew very little going in. I knew from the marketing, Adrien Brody was going to like come to America, look at the upside down Statue of Liberty, laugh like a maniac. And then because of the title, I assumed he was going to like beat up a lot of people, because I know as much about architecture as Trisha does about tennis.
Wow.
And I don't know. I was like, maybe he gets like a job, like
Punisher,
working for the mob. Yeah.
Honestly, I did too. I was delighted when it was like, oh, that brutalism.
Right.
That's okay, cool.
And yeah, just like Michael said, coming out of this one, I was like, I enjoyed watching it, but I don't know if I was ever fully invested in it. I recognize how well made it was. I don't know if I care. Like, you know what I mean? And At times, I was really for the most of the movie, I was really with the movie itself, the character web, the themes, the sort of central plot that's very easy to follow. And then other times I just found it incredibly overbearing and overwrought. And, any time a movie is this sort of big and kind of both long and sort of like, I don't want to say like artsy because that sounds so just like nothing, but you know what I mean? Like a movie that's just sort of is like boldly presenting itself at you and being like, we are going to do this big thing. It's hard not to push back a little and be like, okay, but are you like, is that really, did you need to do all this? And certainly during the last hour, like when they got to Carrera, I was just like, oh, this is going to be a big thematic sequence. Like, I got to pay attention. And I just like didn't have the energy to engage with it. And like they forgot my burger, and that was a whole other thing. But then it's like from there, it's like we have the sexual assault and the overdose, and then the long search for Harrison, and then the epilogue with the like Venice tourism commercial, and then like the epilogue itself. And I was just like, at a certain point, I was just like, man, I can't do the mental work I want to be doing anymore in this movie. And it didn't mean I wasn't still enjoying it. It just meant that I was just like drained. It's like, I'm not a runtime Scrooge, but I do find that there are movies, and the movie could be 2 hours, where I just like, I'm with you. And then at a certain point, I'm not with you anymore. And from there, it's like really hard to kind of get back on track. And sometimes that can just be what a thing is the first time you see it. You just need to go back and be like, cool, now I've done the work on this part. Now I can let myself kind of enjoy this part. But yeah, I think that was part of it, just leaving feeling a little exhausted by it all at the end, even though I did enjoy it and did, everything that Michael was just saying. And reading up on it over this week, kind of preparing for this, it's just like my appreciation has improved of it, but it feels like a very cold, distant, scholarly appreciation, and not that sort of feeling where you're like, oh yeah, like I do really like this movie, or yeah, I can't wait to watch it again, or I really did like that. It was just sort of like, yes, I do appreciate that you did that thing, and I appreciate that symbol meant that. But like that's kind of where it is for me. I like a ranking list of movies in the year, and it's like in the top half, but towards the bottom. And it just sort of like, yeah, that feels right. It feels like a movie I liked, but like didn't like love. In like the 90s, I used to say Dave Matthews Band was either like my favorite band that I didn't like or my least favorite band that I did like. Like I see what you're doing over there is like pretty good, but I don't know if it's for me. But also
right.
Like sometimes I really like it, and sometimes I really don't. So yeah, that's the Brutalist is the Dave Matthews Band of film.
Yeah. Wow.
I got it. Wow.
Brady Corbett would love that assessment.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is not at all something I believe.
I went down a weird Dave Matthews Band like rabbit hole recently for reasons that are too boring to get into, so I won't. Trisha, tell me about The Brutalist.
Yeah. Gonna echo a lot of what you guys have said. This is a very impressive movie. Like the minute it starts, you're just like, oh, I see. It looks like this. It is stunning to look at. Basically, every frame of it is like, I was just knocked over by how this movie looks. It's ridiculously gorgeous. It's so well envisioned and directed. Like, it's really well put together. The performances are all there. Like, the two things that I've learned recently that have really blown me away are that this is Brady Corbet's like third movie, and that it was made for $10 million. And it's like...
And shot in 33 days.
I just like...
And he's younger than us.
Yeah, that's also incredibly rude. He was born in 1988, which is like...
Yeah.
I just was like, wow. It's very, very impressive for all of those reasons. I can't believe this movie only cost $10 million. Yeah. Children, for those of you who are not tuned into what movies cost, that is no money to make a historical epic. Like, it is truly no money.
Red One cost $230 million.
Yeah, it's truly boggling. And I did read that they had all taken big pay cuts to work on this movie. Again, speaking to the power of somebody who really has something to say, right? And a really strong vision for how to tell that story. I really want to praise at the outset all of those aspects of the filmmaking. Like, it's just such an accomplishment. And I think rightfully so, nominated for the number of Oscars that it was, just based alone on the feat of having made it. Like, I'm speechless, clearly. But I'm with you in that the experience of watching it is not one that I like am eager to do again. Partially for just like really boring Oscar movie reasons where, you know, it's not a fun movie where people are smiling and laughing. Like, the tone of it is really heavy from the opening shot. You're like, okay, I'm going to sit down and watch this movie about the grueling immigrant experience. And not that there are not sort of moments of levity sprinkled throughout, but very few. And as you guys have pointed out, the runtime's really long. Not that the plot isn't engaging, but just that there is something about it where you kind of have to feel like you're buckling in. And I do want to also give the caveat that I watched this at home. It's out on streaming now, so I watched it on my television at home in 2 sessions. I watched the first half, and then I took an overnight intermission and watched the second half the next morning. So all of those things being true and having definitely colored my experience of watching it. I do think, like, I want to talk about the tone and the themes, but also, like, the form of the movie. One thing that I find really interesting about it is that it's posturing itself as a biopic in a lot of ways, but is not about a real person. And I think now, having learned that it was made for only $10 million, I can kind of feel the budgetary constraints in the scope of the storytelling, where it's like, it really is kind of only focused on this one relationship, or this one like project, right, in the life of somebody. So I do want to really talk about that, like sort of the tone, scope, like push-pull, like form of the movie. But the other thing that I think is really interesting is the control of information in the POV and what it gives us and what it doesn't give us about the central characters. Because I had a really hard time getting connected to Laszlo, Adrian Brody's character. And if you're not connected to Laszlo, I kind of like, it makes it really hard, I think, to get that emotional piece that we're all sort of missing or have been missing so far in talking about it. And I think that very well is probably intentional on the part of the filmmaker, because the control of information feels so deliberate, and kind of the trade-off that you get, like you kind of get some of these themes that maybe you're going for by using the filmmaking in this way to keep us away from the main character and keep us from knowing stuff about him and keep us from knowing stuff about architecture. The movie is also not interested in teaching you about architecture in any way. Which is interesting for a movie called The Brutalist. I was expecting more architecture, to be honest.
That's what I'm saying. I wanted more brutalism.
I think you're making a trade-off where you're making maybe a more intellectually powerful movie, but maybe an emotionally less powerful movie in some respects. And I'm kind of curious about all of those things. So I'm excited to talk about it with you guys.
Cool. Yeah. Alex, what about you?
So I saw it in an IMAX theater. And I would highly recommend that experience for this movie. Too late for everybody, but it was kind of a thrill to just go to like a really high quality big screen theater and sit down and have this kind of like old Hollywood epic experience, including the intermission. I will also echo that you guys are kind of nailing a lot of the overall feelings I had about the movie as well. But I will say, just the overall umbrella I have around those feelings is kind of a gratitude for a filmmaker stretching $10 million to give me this experience, like to let me go to a theater, like a big high quality theater, and like get to have the old Hollywood thing that we don't get anymore, which is just like a really well-made American epic with an intermission that kind of just like lets me like soak in cinema for 3 hours. And unlike our other recent 3.5 hour epics by Mr. Scorsese, which like are highly praised and I like want to like, and I feel like I should like. I just don't like. I did not like The Irishman, and I just like could not get into it. And it was so long. I did see it in a theater, and I was warm, and it was uncomfortable, and I wanted to get out of there. And when I think about Curse of the Flower Moon, so much in that movie I like, but it just loses me at some point, and I want it to be over. And there was something really interesting about The Brutalist, where you kind of mentioned it, Michael. For as long as it is, there's something about the pacing and just kind of there's something about the movie that always kept my interest, and I was always leaning forward. I was always kind of interested in what's going on with these characters in this scene, even when I was kind of uncomfortable or like, where is this movie going? What are we doing? I was still like, it was still provoking me. It was kind of giving me these jolts of, whoa, we're going here now, in a way that kind of, I guess I would say like more sleepy, or I don't know, kind of even keeled 3.5 hour epics. They don't give me that kind of a jolt of energy that this movie gave me pretty regularly. So anyway, yeah, just a really interesting experience going to see it in a theater by myself, which was great too. Just nobody next to me who was getting impatient or didn't like it. I could just be myself with this movie. Highly recommend that experience more often. And I saw it a second time in IMAX because I was like, you know what? I don't think watching this at home will ever be the same as this, old school theater experience. And I kind of don't really want to watch it at home now because there was something special about that. So yeah, nothing much more to add to what you guys have been saying, except for I think it's cool when a movie is like designed for an old school theater experience the way this one was, including that built-in intermission. And it was something that was really special. But I do think, yeah, the second half of the movie especially goes to some very dark places, gives me like bad feelings. I talk about feel bad movies and how I appreciate those too, where it's just like, you have brought out in me like very icky feelings, and that's impressive. Like I don't want to feel these things, but you made me feel them, movie. This director, Brady Corbett, as an actor, his previous career was as an actor. He worked with directors like Lars von Trier, and I think he has some lineage with the feel bad movie directors. And I could feel that here in The Brutalist, where it's like, he's not interested in making a American classic about the immigrant experience that ultimately leaves you feeling kind of like, wow, America. It's like, by the end of this movie, there's, they literally call it out. Like, this country is rotten. This place is rotten. The food's making us sick. Like there's a rot in this movie that is really interesting. So yeah, lots to talk about. Made me feel lots of things, not all of them good, but I respect it for making me feel those things.
Yeah. Yeah, you didn't mention this directly, but I think in terms of keeping you interested in those jolts that like draw your attention back in, the sound design and the music in this movie is doing so much work. I feel like I do need to see it again to like be able to like get a better grasp on that. But there were just moments where I was like, man, the sound is like crisp. Like the visuals feel, shot on film, feels, of a time period, but the sound is absolutely like modern sound design, doing anything and everything it can to set the mood, to match the cut, either with the sound comes at the same moment, or there's just like a swell or something tonally happening that makes you feel a way when you look at a thing. And so I think the sound and the music working in concert with the visuals and with the performances helps create that state of mind that I think keeps it kept it like intriguing for me too.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, it was part of the thrill of a theater experience was kind of like, I think about, Wicked, which you talked about. That's the first half of a musical, and the way Act One ends is a thrill. The Defying Gravity, it sends you into intermission with this like pumped up feeling. And I had that with this movie too, where there's this montage with the music swelling and these kind of like literal hammer drop sounds, kind of industrial sounds as
steel.
Yeah.
Steel.
yeah. And we hear the letter from his wife of like, she's going to come to America now. And like, it was cool that the movie, it's using, as you're saying, Michael, these kind of old school techniques like VistaVision, and yet it's very modern as well, and isn't afraid to just be like on the nose and bold and use music to manipulate you 100%, which I appreciate, because maybe part of what is happening in those like sleepier Scorsese epics is it's not maybe modern in the same way, or it's maybe less emotionally manipulative in a way that I actually appreciate. Like, please manipulate me, keep me interested.
I think an interesting thing, for better or for worse, structurally, is I was actually thinking about Wicked. I was thinking randomly after we were podcasting about it, I was like, how long do I want Wicked to be? And I was like, I don't want it to be 2 hours and 42 minutes or whatever, but I don't want it to be 90 minutes, right? It's like, I want it to be big and epic, but I want it to be shorter. And a lot of times that's what happens with a lot of musicals or plays, is the first act will be like an hour and 20 minutes, and the second act is like 55 minutes or something like that, right? So it kind of feels like you go in and you're like, you don't have to do that much work all over again. You get like a little treat of like, we're gonna be like really kind of ramping up the pace and ramping up the stuff that's happening, and it's going to be shorter. And I think that's part of what is happening. What the second half of the Brutalist is working against is that we're expecting, one, for the second half of a movie to be shorter, but two, for kind of third act pacing that we expect. Things start kind of driving towards a final moment, and instead, a lot of those moments in the second half are just as long and lingery and whatever as the first half. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing in terms of us feeling comfortable during those moments and us feeling like we're with the movie, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's like, I don't know how I'm going to think how this movie is going to be looked upon in 5 years or 10 years. It could be like the greatest movie of the decade, or it could just be like it came and went. I don't know. So it's hard to know how those things will sort of last. But I did find myself realizing that was an interesting thing that the movie was doing really well in the first half. And then the second half was just like, it was still doing the same stuff, but it felt like we kind of, our expectation for movies is for it to start ramping up and moving a little faster at that point.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. And, Trisha, you called out wanting to talk about the form. And I feel like we're here. We should talk about the form.
Yep.
Because I think it's, we talk about midpoints a lot, and a lot of good midpoints do feel like the end of, the first act of a play, where it's like, curtain drop, something big has happened. And now you come back and it's setting up the second half. Others feel like they're just accelerants, and it's like, okay, now like the movie's kicking into gear. Some people don't put midpoints at all in their movies, but it is interesting how the shape and the form of this movie really does feel like you're watching a really long stage play. And like you're saying, that second act, it's not the back end of the story. It's like, no, and now we're telling this part of the story. We're going to introduce a new character, right? Felicity Jones isn't in the first half.
It's like a big reset,
the movie
in a lot of ways,
right?
Yeah, and
it's kind of like a different sub story. Like each act has kind of their sub stories that is part of the bigger story, and it's kind of cool. They probably didn't need, obviously, to put an intermission in here, and I would imagine as a theater goer, that's an appreciative, generous thing of like, I can take a break, but it also asks us to kind of consider the form of the movie by intentionally breaking it into two halves and announcing it like that.
Right. I was actually expecting, when I saw, like, reading about the intermission and said like, oh, it's basically 2 hour and 40 minute movies, I was kind of expecting for the movie to actually be two almost separate stories with the same character or something, right? And obviously we get, like Felicity Jones, we get a different thing happening in the second half, but it's very much one 3.5 hour long story. And I wonder if that was part of it. I wonder if it had really reset and been like, now here's this whole other thing that this whole other journey, if I would have been able to kind of feel like I was watching a new movie and have like a new energy. But it was hard for me not to just feel like I was watching a 3.5 hour movie and to have those same expectations. But you're totally right. Movies aren't presented like this. Movies aren't presented with like prologue, epilogue, part 1, part 2 that are kind of inviting you to be like, start over. Now we're going into a whole second thing, like recharge your batteries and let's go.
Yeah, I mean, to me, my experience with the intermission was that it was kind of critical, like for my enjoyment of the movie, because getting to like step out and then like step back in and kind of feel refreshed and like now I'm ready to engage with the part two. If it had just flowed right into part two, I think I would have had the same problem I mentioned of having with those Scorsese movies, where it's just like there's a certain limit and there's a certain exhaustion point I have, but just that 15-minute break is enough to reset and kind of want to come back, as opposed to like, I'm stuck here, I'm trapped here, I can't leave.
I have so many thoughts, and they may not be neat and tidy, so I apologize in advance. I do feel like I wish I had time to see this movie again, or even watch like certain scenes and sequences again, because obviously there's a lot packed in here. I do wonder about introducing, like, essentially they're making the introduction of Erzsébet, right, and Sophia, who come, his wife and his niece who come over. That's kind of like the midpoint twist that spins the story in a new direction. So we know they're coming. That's where the intermission leaves us. We know they're going to make it over. I do wonder about that in relationship to what is essentially the A plot, right? The A plot is really about his relationship with Harrison Van Buren. He's named after 2 U.S. presidents. I was like, okay, I get it.
This is America's relationship with immigrants.
I get it. His middle name is Lee. His name is Harrison Lee Van Buren. Is a general. I was like, okay, I get it. So it's really, this is about his relationship with Harrison, right? But the purported reason that he's in this relationship, he gets hired to do this building. There's some stops and starts to the relationship, but then that once it really kicks off, that's what it is. And I kind of wonder about the interrelationship of those two structures, because, we've been identifying that maybe the second half of it feels a little long. And I do wonder if instead of building up to his wife and his niece coming over, you could have had that be like part of the, the new world, like sometimes called Fun and Games, or like the first half of the second act of the entire movie. Bring them over and have they're starting work on the construction of the building. It's all going really well. The wife and the niece are here. And then have, maybe the train crash be the midpoint where he gets totally fired. And now what is he going to do? The project is shut down. Like, that feels to me almost a more natural midpoint, not just because you could then do the time jump really seamlessly, but also just because it's the traditional like spin, like the midpoint twist that spins the story in a new direction. And where's he going to go from here? Earlier, I alluded to knowing that the budget of this movie was actually very low. I do wonder what a filmmaker, really, I don't mean the filmmaker, but I'm thinking about somebody like Scorsese, right, who can have as much money as he wants to make his historical epics. If you'd had twice the budget or 3 times the budget, which is still not a lot in terms of a movie like this, but I wonder what it would have opened up in terms of maybe the scope of the story. I wonder if he might have gone on to build a different building, or like been working on something else, or established relationships outside of this very tight network of characters. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the right way to go, but it does open thematic possibilities for you to sort of widen the scope of this. Now, obviously, again, this is posturing itself as this like really gritty, grounded, historical biopic almost, but really it's more of like a fable, like in the way that we talked about There Will Be Blood, right? Where it's really more about just like people who represent stuff. So you don't necessarily need a lot more angles on this story, because what you have is characters that are being distilled, these ideas that are being distilled into these characters, and the characters are symbols and they represent things like the presidents that I was talking about. But like, yeah, so I'm not saying, again, that that's the right way to go, but I did start to feel a little bit of like, we're never going to get off this hillside in Pennsylvania, are we?
That was my childhood.
Like, we're never going to... Brian's from Pennsylvania, everybody. But like, we're never going to get out of this town. We're never going to get out of these tiny apartments. We're never going to get off this hillside in Pennsylvania. And again, thematically, I think what you're doing is powerful, but also it starts to show the seams a little bit in terms of like what the filmmaker is doing and why.
It's interesting because I've heard interviews with Brady Corbett, and he claims, this is also take it with a grain of salt. He claims that it would have been the exact same movie. It would have been a lot easier and nicer to make if he had a bigger budget. He made exactly the movie he wanted to make. So, according to him, but I also would assume that budget is in their heads when they're writing a movie, knowing how hard it is to get a movie like this financed. And so from the inception, I'm sure there was a goal of keeping it in a smaller scale, contained, smaller cast, yada, yada. But I do think it's, what you're pointing out, Trisha, is really, as the movie progressed, it was dawning on me, this is, less of a, story about a real-ish person and more a fable about the immigrant experience. And especially when it gets into the more kind of shocking twists and turns of Act 2 and the sexual assaults in Italy, you almost feel like the movies could be jumping the shark here in an interesting, in a like, whoa, what? That's what we're doing now? The way the movie ends, too, is a little bit jarring. But taken in this form of the fable, it all seems to kind of fit better. Like these are representatives of, forces and powers in the world, and it's like not about actual people in the end. So it's that's part of what left me kind of unsettled and reeling after the movie was over. Was like, what is this actually? And these things that made me feel and the things the characters did ultimately started to feel less and less like we're in reality, and we're in this more representative space by the end.
Well, and I think it's interesting. So as I mentioned earlier, they're having the introduction of the Felicity Jones character, Erzsébet, be the midpoint as though it is a twist, or as though it is going to spin the story in a new direction. And it doesn't for like a really significant part of the second act. She actually is not like pushing and pulling the plot in a lot of ways. She has more agency than you might expect, especially in the finale, which we must talk about. Where she's the one to go and confront Harrison. But it is confusing to me why, like, when we come back in after the intermission and she's there and I'm like, okay, what's going to happen? Is it all going to come crashing down? Is there something with her that's going to ruin it, or Sophia, or whatever it is? Like, what's all going to transpire because they came here? And actually what transpires kind of has very little to do with the fact that they came there, right? Like, their actual arrival maybe changes the character a little bit, but not really his relationship to his work, because again, the A plot is doing one thing and the B plot is kind of doing this other thing. And they're not super closely interrelated, or at least not obvious in their relationship for a good chunk of the first half of the second. No. How am I phrasing this? After we get back from the intermission, there's like 45 minutes where they don't change anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. I agree with you that there's not a good causal reason for the change, but it's pretty quickly when the second half of the movie begins that we get the first kind of gross moment with Harrison of him kind of tossing that coin across the table at Laszlo. So it does seem like the change that happens there is like there's this, the American dream was on the up and up and up. And here we're like, ooh, it's souring. Something is actually icky about this relationship and the power dynamic. And I don't know. I agree with you, Trisha. It's not explicit why the appearance of Erzsébet and Sophia would like kick that into high gear or like bring that change about, because she's impressive. She speaks English better than him and yada, yada. So I don't know why that would trigger the sliding into like crappy treatment of immigrants, but it seems like that's what changes at the midpoint. And I agree. I'm not sure if there's a one-to-one connection with their arrival to trigger that.
Well, there is something about the sort of control that people have over specifically Laszlo. So we see it with Attila, where it's like when Laszlo can sort of be his pet that he can bring in and say like, look at the American dream, look how great everything is, da da da, great. But then once he starts having success, then he becomes a problem. He's not good anymore, right? So and I think we see a similar thing with Harrison, which is when Laszlo can be his sort of plaything, then it's all well and good. But it could also be like, look, he has a successful family and he's actually doing well now, and like things are actually starting to go, and he's starting to kind of take charge of the situation a little bit. Then it becomes like, no, that's not what you are for, And then it's like, yeah, when the sexual assault scene happens, as you were saying, Alex, the sort of fable parable of it all, I was just like, oh, he's getting screwed by the American dream, like very literally, you know what I mean?
Literally.
Right. But it's like in that moment, I wasn't even thinking like, oh, that wasn't really set up for the characters or da-da-da. It's like that didn't even matter. I was just like, oh, I know what the movie is saying with its movie pieces. I know how it's using them to like tell me a thing. So yeah, I just thought that's all very interesting.
That's actually a good point, and maybe helps explain that midpoint turn with their appearance, because yeah, the appearance of this full life that Laszlo had before, he's not just the plaything, as you say, Brian. He's not just the poor immigrant who I can pick up from the bootstraps and give him this job. It's like he has a more complex life, and somebody who loves him, and if Harrison has kind of a dark attraction to him, there's maybe a jealousy or kind of like I don't possess you 100% anymore. These people also possess you in a familial way, and that's interesting. I think there's something about that where that's part of what sours is Laszlo no longer belongs to Harrison alone after that midpoint.
Yeah, and of course, there's the sexual menace from Harry towards,
of course,
towards Sophia. Yeah, and that also starts pretty quickly there after their arrival. And Harry starts to show his true colors to Laszlo too, up on that hilltop where he's like, "We tolerate you, but like we want you to get out of here." Basically, I think that you're right in that. Tonally, the movie is taking a turn, and the characters are starting to make more overt decisions at revealing their true colors. But at the same time, it's kind of like the like train crash piece of it, and the like project falling apart, and what that has to do. Like then they have all the stuff about like the ceiling height and like you're going to take it out of my fee, but as it turns out, no one's getting paid anyway because the project's not happening. Like, I don't know. There's all of this stuff about like warring over goals and that never go anywhere. And that kind of feels like not fable-ish. That feels like more grounded, like drama stuff of like, yeah, that doesn't, I don't know what it represents.
Mm.
Yeah.
Michael, shut up.
I know. I'm talking too much. This is all just really interesting and fascinating. And yeah, so I think calling out that this movie is working in metaphor and as fable is exactly right. And I think I needed to hear that because I don't think the movie tells me that. And I think, Trisha, you've even kind of said, it feels like a biopic, and it does. It feels almost like it's going out of its way to feel like it's trying to tell the story. Like multiple times I kind of automatically reached for my phone to be like, so what happened to this guy? And then my brain was like, no, this isn't a real person. I know it's not a real person, but just like the form of it and the way it's asking, I felt it was asking me to read it was in that mode. And
very much like Tar in that way, which was also people like, oh, who was Lady Tar? It's like, no, that's not a real person.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think I enjoyed the first half of the movie more than the second half. But I think part of that was like, I don't know. It felt like there was even the setup work that was being done for the character kind of felt like the first half of like a downfall arc where you're starting to see the cracks in the seams of this like potential mad genius and what's going to like bring him down. But and that's kind of where the story goes. But as you guys are talking about, by the second half, that doesn't seem the movie doesn't seem to be about that. It seems to be about the sort of metaphorical representation of what's happening, and less about this person as a character and his character flaws and those character turns being where like the theme is kind of centrally located. And so to me, the first half and the second half did kind of feel like different movies in a certain way, because it felt like it was in a different mode of storytelling. And I don't know, maybe there's something in this as to why that is. Because there's also there's a lot in the first half that I think you could remove if you were just telling like a simple character story. Then in retrospect, looking at it through metaphor, it's like, oh, all of this is like really important texture and detail. At the time when I was watching it, I was like, I don't know that I need to know all this or spend this much time in this world. before the plot starts happening, I'm enjoying it because it's interesting and extremely well executed. But from a strictly utilitarian standpoint, I think if you were just telling the plot version of this movie, you could have cut a lot of that. And anyway, I feel like that's why this movie feels so interesting, is that it's doing multiple things at once, and yeah, how it moves between them is slippery and interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. And this kind of brings me to the control of information piece that I brought up at the beginning that I want to talk about, because we know nothing about Laszlo. Or rather, we know very little about Laszlo at the outset of the movie. And we know very little about architecture. And I think it's cool and a smart choice to make Laszlo a very accomplished person and a very accomplished artist, right? Because in this movie, he is the archetype of an artist, right? Who is doing his art, and people are trying to interfere with him doing his art and all of that. But the movie doesn't tell us that he's an artist at the outset, or the breadth of his accomplishments, or really anything about him. Like, I'm like, oh, okay, he's married, he has a niece. There's some expository work done where, when we see Attila for the first time, and of course in the letter that we hear in voiceover from his wife. And I'm like picking up tiny like expository crumbs, and I'm just trying to use them to like make a portrait of this person. And then in his interactions with people, the character work is all, done in sort of like detail, where it's like all in his manner and all in the way that he carries himself and the way that he's smoking and the way that he's like, I'm not going to take this towel off from around my neck to talk to this important client. I'm just going to come in here in my suspenders and my half-shaved face and all this stuff. So it's like that's all character work that's being done, but it's not doing much to create like a life, right? And importantly, it's not doing much to fill in the crucial pieces of information that we need to know about why he's an architect. What does it mean? What are the value systems of the character? And on a metaphorical level, I'm not sure you need them. But as you're saying, Michael, from like a character standpoint, where I'm trying to stay in this movie in like a somewhat grounded way in the first half, I'm like, I'm literally dying to know what you want. Like, other than it seems like he kind of does want his wife to come over, but it's not like he's talking about it all the time. It's not like he's writing, we hear his side of the like longing letters to her or something like that. Like, I guess that's what he wants. He seems like he does want to really build this really cool library. But again, I don't know what that means to him to do that or accomplish that, or like, I think there's just a lot of missing expository information if you're reading the movie on any level other than like metaphorical. Thinking about it more, because I was feeling frustrated by that fact, I do think it's possibly really deliberate, where we're being put in the position of people in the United States who are looking at immigrants as other, and knowing nothing about their lives and knowing nothing about their accomplishments and judging them on their accents, right? And like things like that, I think the movie's kind of putting us deliberately in that position. And I think it's interesting that we almost never see Laszlo by himself and like being like acting unto himself, other than when he's like sketching. Most of the time when we see him, we're with somebody else and looking at him almost through somebody else's lens.
Even when he's like discovered in the shower.
Yeah, exactly. Gordon
right.
goes looking for him and finds him using in the shower. Yeah, like that kind of thing. There are most of the cases where we are with Laszlo, we're actually with somebody else's POV, and we're just kind of looking at him from the outside. And so, as I alluded to earlier, I think there's possibly something really deliberate happening thematically with withholding all this information about who Laszlo is, what he cares about, what he wants. Who is he? That being said, it can be distancing, because it really did distance me. And it really is just an unconventional choice. Like, he doesn't come in going, hey, Attila, I really want to get back into making my brutalist architecture because it's really important for me as an artist, and here's what it represents. Like, I would have loved, like, that would have hooked me into the character instantly. Not that exactly, but that type of clearly establishing who he is and his value system and why he makes buildings that are square. You're just kind of trying to hold two things at once.
Yeah, and I think that I felt that complication with Laszlo, which is just, as we've talked about, before, it's not about having to like a character, be on their side, but it is about knowing what they want and what they're doing, and also knowing what the filmmaker is doing. And he's a complicated character, and that's part of the point. But it was just like, oh, he's like kind of fresh-faced, like getting off the boat and coming and like trying to make a name for himself. So I'm like rooting for you. But also you have a wife and you're just like hooking up with this woman, this place or whatever. And then like now you're using, but like, is that kind of the beginning of like a downfall arc? Or is that like, because I'm all for, you can get all, like he does in the second half, you can become like the most miserable like piece of crap ever, as long as that's part of what the movie is doing at that point. And then whether you're going to come back from that or whether you're not, and that's what the movie is trying to tell me. But I always felt like I was kind of bouncing all around with Laszlo, or I was just never quite sure whether I was supposed to be aligned with him or specifically not aligned with him or whatever. And I think that's by design, but it didn't help. It didn't help me kind of like stay attached to him as a character.
Yeah.
It's interesting thinking about like the performances and like the style of performances with that too. Like as you were talking there, Brian and Trisha, I was thinking about our conversation about Network and how Network announces itself as a satire. It's clearly pointing to the things it wants you to be thinking about. And part of that is the performances, the writing style. Like there is style happening that is signaling a kind of heightened universe. And I feel like the performances in this are so real that it's kind of working against that, or at least was for me. But like but I feel like that's also what kept me hooked. Is like I agree that I couldn't initially point to, I know who Laszlo is, I know what he wants, I know what all of this like means to him. Eventually, I feel like I had enough of those pieces to put that together. But moment to moment, I just felt that this character was rendered so realistically with all these little contradictions and these like moments of subtext where I can see that he's getting what other people are saying and how he's trying to diffuse situations or navigate things. Like it just felt so like real. And Felicity Jones too, like all these performances feel so well observed, feel so like honest about how a human would try to navigate in so many of these scenarios in a really empathetic way, because you know what they're really dealing with. And so it's like, wow, I can see the energy you're putting into like trying to make the situation like better for everyone. So I was really involved emotionally because of the performances and how those characters navigated some of these situations, even if I didn't have the clear, this is the objective, I've sung my What I Want song in the musical that like would have like helped make that happen. I was still involved almost because of how much I felt like these were human people.
Yeah, I'll echo what you just said, Michael, because I agree. I agree with the idea that I was not kind of like one-to-one putting myself into these characters as like, you are my surrogate because I understand you deeply and I am you and I want what you want. It was more of that distance. Like I'm looking at you from a distance, but I'm really interested. And I think it's because of the performances and because the movie lets everything be so messy and complicated and kind of like, well, what's really going on here? Like, with Attila, the way he's kind of like throwing Laszlo at his wife, one moment and kind of like dressing up in the apron and kind of throughout the whole movie, there's kind of these mentions of like homosexuality right at the top where it's like, do you prefer boys? The madame at the brothel and the physicality with which Attila and Laszlo, when they first greet each other, it's a beautiful like human like intensity. But there's also this kind of strange like almost three-way flirtation happening with his wife in that kind of drunk dinner scene. And so yeah, there's just all these messy human things happening that I can't even quite put my finger on. And when Attila kind of dismisses Laszlo, kicks him out, it's there's many layers to what's maybe going on there. It's like, who's jealous of who, and does your wife just want him out because she's like racist against, immigrants, or like, are you feeling weird about what happened last night? Like, so like there's so many like layers to it, and it's so messy that the movie's not really giving you a clear answer or a clean explanation. It's just these like very messy human things are happening, and they're performed, as you're saying, Michael, in such like a grounded, realistic way that you just lean forward because you're like, oh, you're giving me so much. I don't even quite know how it adds up, but there's so much here, and it seems intentional. And I want to know what's going on. And that movie kind of kept me hooked in that way, but also unsettled because I didn't know what was going on. Mm-hmm. But something's going on, and it's really interesting, and it's really layered, and it's messy and human.
I'm glad that you're calling out the like weird sexual tension in virtually every scene in this. Even when he's like, Sophia's there, and he's like gonna, like, here's where you're sleeping. Here's a photo of your mom, my sister. She was so beautiful. So beautiful. I'm like, what's going on? And maybe it's just Adrian Brody. Like, I don't
but the movie has a lot of sexual content. I mean, and like
definitely
the whole scene where Elizabeth almost overdoses, and I was so worried about osteoporosis during that sex. It's like, don't break her. But the movie goes to really strange, interesting sexual places, and which is also part of the jarring juxtaposition of like the VistaVision 50s look, but then these very modern, explicit, content is in here.
Well, and that was what I was just gonna say, which is like there's subtext that feels really loaded. And like a lot of it never goes anywhere. It's just in subtext. And I think that's why. So the rape scene has been critiqued. And you highlighted earlier, Alex, that it's like, it's a bold choice, to have the character relationship become that literal, right? Where it's like, we've seen that there is hatred from Harrison and abuse from Harrison as well. And then for it to become this literalized, that it moves into the area of crime. Now, I was expecting like someone's gonna get killed here, right? When he's like wandering out of the bar and they're in the quarry. Mm-hmm. Still, they're sleeping in the quarry.
So surreal. That whole sequence is very surreal.
They're at the quarry party. Yeah. But it has like a very like P.T. Anderson, There Will Be Blood kind of like growing tension of like, there's going to be an explosion of violence. And there is. But it is like, it's the subtext becoming the text, right? It's becoming literalized in the most upsetting way possible, really. And so like, I think that people have kind of like pushed back in some ways where it's like, okay, you took the metaphor and then it's like, it's very on the nose. And there are other things in here that I think are also very on the nose. Like, I don't think ultimately the movie is subtle in its messaging. Like, the upside down Statue of Liberty, the upside down cross. I see them. They're there. They're lasting images that are being burned into the text of the film that are doing very clear symbolic work. And so, I think ultimately the subtext is interesting, and I almost find it more interesting than those places where the message just becomes like, and here it is.
And again, the second half is where a lot of that happens, where the first half is just, it feels like you're like hopping stepping stone, and it just, there's like, the floor is not lava, the floor is subtext, and there's just so much of it, and you're just like, oh my God, I'm like, wow, there's so much subtext.
Don't step on the subtext. It'll burn you. Well, so speaking of subtext and the second half of the movie, do we want to talk about the epilogue sequence, the Venice sequence? Because I think that is a very provocative, interesting kind of coda to this story. Or do we want to save that?
No, yeah, I'm trying to like reload in my brain. Also, like the final line is what again?
It's not the journey, it is the destination.
It is the destination.
Yeah. Whatever the others might try to sell you.
Right.
It's not the journey. Yeah.
So it's because that ending is so kind of sudden and shocking, where we go into like the 80s and now we're in this kind of VHS video land, which is kind of a cool progression. We've seen like the film reels, setting the stage for earlier eras. Now we're plopped into the 80s in this jarring way. And we see Laszlo is now silent. Like he is very old and frail and maybe not entirely mentally there. We're not with him for long enough to know. But Zofia, who was once mute, is now kind of speaking for him. And she is presenting what is being presented as the official interpretation of his work. But she herself, has been established as having a political agenda and having political beliefs and around Israel and her, journey there. And so there's something very interesting and provocative, I think, about that ending, where it's a retrospective on the work of this artist. He no longer is kind of there speaking for himself. Someone else is now kind of speaking for him. And the movie's kind of asking us, I'm not sure what it's asking us, but it's kind of, she's presenting this kind of very literal interpretation of his architecture, saying this represents him in the concentration camp and his wife in the other one. And, the halls or the underground tunnels are connecting them. And, but we never see Laszlo reference any of that earlier in the movie. We never see him talk to his wife about it. Maybe that is all what it was the entire time, or maybe it wasn't. But there's this, so the movie leaves me in this very interesting, uncomfortable place of, is she kind of unlocking the key to him at the end here? Or is actually this is doing something else, where it's like she's taken his work and has made it what she wants it to be, So anyway, that's where the movie left me. And it was a very interesting place to leave me. It's like this whole movie could have ended a lot of different ways. And this is how he ended it, with this sequence, with this kind of like this final line that is not easy to immediately pinpoint. Like, how does that connect? What does that mean? So yeah, curious to hear your interpretations and what that final line means to you.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. The quick thing I'll say is just also, the movie, regardless of the fact that it's Zofia, which is obviously very purposeful, there is also the thing of, once an artist is no longer around, all we have left is our interpretations of their art, right? But yeah, I agree. I feel like part of the frustration of the second half of this movie is not feeling like things are building towards each other in a way that feels like it's like, I got it now. It feels like it's a little kind of, there's this over here, there's this over here, there's this over here, and now we have a point at the end of it. I'm like, wait, okay. Just that sort of exhaustive feeling I am at the end, where I'm just like, oh, you're going to throw new stuff at me now?
Right.
It's been quite a while.
Yeah, I overall liked the epilogue because earlier in the movie, I wanted to hear somebody smart interpret Laszlo's work for me, or for Laszlo to tell me remotely anything about it, or about brutalism as a movement. Like, I know a little bit about art and architecture, like what brutalism as a movement represents. I don't feel like I have a really clear understanding of like why this time, this place, this artist, this movement, why architecture, why this building, right? Even if none of it is like real, like why are we focusing on this? If it's not a real thing, then you picked it, right? If this wasn't a real person and this wasn't a real thing, then you just picked this. Why'd you pick it? I'm curious about that, and I think the epilogue goes a long way towards helping me understand. I love Sophia's interpretation of, he was basically processing like his internment at the camps, and like, I definitely see, again, the movie's not subtle, the parallels. Like, he comes to the United States, he's still imprisoned. I get it. It looks like a prison from the inside. I get it. Now, standing that next to, I don't know what happened to Harrison Lee Van Buren. The implication is that he decided to end his own life out of shame somewhere inside his building. He must have gotten out there quick.
Yeah,
I was thinking about that. I was like, they're after him with like dogs and flashlights and like He doesn't seem like you that fast. I don't think he had. Okay.
That is part of the like total transition to Fable at that point for me, where it's just like he just has disappeared into the mist and he can't be found. Like America is lost, it cannot be found, or something like that. Yeah.
That and like if you confront America with its sins, it vanishes. I guess. Like, I don't know. I was like,
it
okay,
is lost forever. Yeah.
I was like, so she's gonna walk in here and just say it out loud, which I kind of love as a choice. And then everybody's reactions are kind of their own thing, which I think you could totally endlessly analyze, right? Where Harry's like gonna kick her walker out from under her, and then the sister's like, "I'm so sorry," right? And then everyone's like, "We're going away, bye." I don't know.
That is the Lars von Trier of it all, right there. Where it's just like we're now going to be extra cruel and like kick your walker out. Yeah. This is how awful America is.
But then also I was like, okay, well, Harrison's gonna go kill himself, and then I don't know, he just disappeared, and the movie wasn't interested in me definitely knowing what happened to him, and I would love someone's interpretation of what that means. Maybe I just need to watch the movie again, and it will announce itself somehow. But anyway, the implication is that he decides to end his own life in the Brutalist building. And there's the upside down cross, and I am just really struggling with what they mean. And then there's the interpretation of them, which I think is beautiful, by Zofia at the end. And then the actress who was playing Zofia is now playing Zofia's daughter.
So
right,
weird.
that was confusing
That
too.
was
like, what?
It's just like literally the same actress. Yeah.
Very choices, but yeah. And it's so 80s, and it's just like, okay. It's kind of a lot to parse, is how I'm going to leave this. And I was not able to parse it on first viewing.
Yeah, I'm rapidly trying to scrub through the movie because there is a line, and as far as like why Laszlo brutalism, basically.
Well, he gives his explanation to Harrison.
He does
at the Christmas party
Right.
or whatever. Yeah, and it's hard to follow what he says because it's so poetic and kind of convoluted.
Right. Yeah. I guess like what I got from it was sort of there's like a resiliency to brutalism of like, this is, because I think his story is something to the effect of there are lots of buildings, now they're all destroyed except for mine or something to that effect. And so that was kind of the lens I was trying to interpret a lot of this through, as like, I, as an architect, am going to make a thing that is going to last, and I can send it forward into the future. And so the epilogue is then the next generation taking what's been created for them and using it however they need to use it to make their statement.
I think that's probably the best interpretation. Yeah.
And I feel like it has to be something about, it's called the Brutalist. So I feel like the brutalism of it needs to factor into that. And that's kind of how it connected.
And the generational thing that's happening in that finale, where you see the daughter of Sofia, you see Sofia, and as you said, she is now owning it and using it, for the next generation.
Yeah. And then there's also the Carrara marble is like, there's only a limited amount of it. So basically it is going to not be around someday. And it's like, we see it in its homeland, right? Before it then gets picked up and taken to other countries, used for whatever in, some house that then gets, torn down and whatever, just used for whatever, and then completely forgotten about. And then one day it's not going to be there anymore, so there is that connection as well. Also, in the script, it's a throwaway, it's an off-screen line, but the end is we push on a single volunteer. She walks past the marble altarpiece. It's a thing of extraordinary beauty. This is at the end when they're looking for Harrison. Volunteer off-screen. We've got something down here. Yeah. And then the sun forms a sign, and the cross is Laszlo. So frequency demonstrated in his model, and we tilt up to snow falling from above, which has blown in from outside. So the script at least gives you a tiny, 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 tiny bit more of a clue as to Harrison's fate.
We've got something down here.
Yep. It's probably not, he's just hanging out and he's fine.
Right.
Because then it would be, I found him. But it is not helpful.
There's even to obviously that the sexual assault feels like a big turn and isn't super forecasted in some ways, but there is this little moment in when the Van Buren character is talking about like how close he was with his mother that just like
oh, he definitely had some mommy issues.
Something, again, don't fall in the subtext, like it's all that. Anyway, it's very rich. There's so many things in it. It's so well constructed, and yeah, it feels so dense. It feels brutalistic, almost like it's dense, and it's not like everything there is doing stuff. It feels so intentional. All of the collaborators clearly like came to play, and it feels like sometimes I watch Star Wars and I'm like, people had to make Star Wars. It didn't, like, there was a time before this movie when it didn't exist, and like that doesn't make sense because it just feels like this thing has always existed because it's Star Wars for me. This is a new movie that already feels like that to me. Like I don't quite understand how people went and made this movie
for $10 million.
Yeah.
For $10 million.
Bonkers.
Yeah, it just feels like this, I don't know, an artifact that has emerged and like should have always existed and almost has always existed. And I'm just watching it for the first time. Very interesting movie. Why don't we go around and say what lessons we're going to take from The Brutalist? Brian, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I not knowing anything about this movie, I kind of expected it to be a little more episodic. One, because I thought maybe the two parts would be kind of totally disparate stories. And two, just something about the opening credits. It was like Guy Pearce and Felicity Jones. I was like, oh, we're gonna like go on a little adventure. He's gonna have the Guy Pearce sequence, and then maybe the length too, and then he's gonna like move along in his life, and then he's gonna meet Felicity Jones, who I didn't know was his wife, obviously. And like then there's gonna be that thing, and we're gonna kind of follow this guy as he's going throughout. And I was fine with that. But I was very surprised, and we get that a little with Attila and Audrey in the first little bit. But I was very surprised to realize, leading up to the midpoint, that like, oh, this movie is just like 6 characters for 3.5 hours, and we talked about this with Network, where we said like there's basically a bunch of people, but there's only so many characters that you're actually following. And I realized that was doing a lot of work in helping keep me focused and oriented, I guess, and not feeling like the movie was dragging or whatever. And again, part of what we're identifying in the second act is that it does in the second half is that it does a little jumping around and stuff. But for the most part, this movie feels very much just something as simple as like we're building a building. And like it's gonna take half the movie to like decide we're building a building. It's take the second half of the movie to build the building. Just that is enough to be like, okay, cool. Where are we with the building, right? LA Confidential, we talked about how great Guy Pearce is. He's so good in this movie. But no, we talked about how it's just like there's one case and everything. All the weird spiderwebby stuff is all kind of coming back to this one case. And we're in one location a lot of the time, and there's something about the tapestry of all of that together, the small cast, the centralized location, the one project that everything is working towards. Even Erzsébet and Zsófia, like they are characters in the first half of the movie. Like they are, like it's her letters and everything like that. When they show up, I don't feel like, oh, this is new stuff I got to deal with. This is like, no, I feel like I already know these people to some extent. We met Zsófia briefly at the beginning. We've heard Erzsébet's letters. Like there's something about it that makes it all feel like it's all connected, and I just felt like very comfortable watching this movie. And I'm always interested in what makes things feel like that. And I think there's so much, there's anything from editing and production design to structure and who knows, dialogue, whatever, like all that stuff. I think there are so many ways that things can make you feel off and disoriented and like, oh man, I don't even know what's going on right now, or I just feel tired, like all that stuff. And I think for the most part, this, other than the stuff we've identified, The Brutalist I think is generally worth studying for something that always is able to feel sort of comfortable and focused without buckling under its own weight. You don't have here's 30 characters. What movie were we talking about in the past, like, I don't know, 6 months or something, where like I read the character list and it was like 40 characters or something like that. I have to go figure out what it is. But this movie, I mean, it basically, it's like you've got Laszlo's family, you've got Harrison's family, you've got Attila and Audrey, you've got Gordon, and like that's it. Like that's not to say there aren't other characters who show up here and there, but for the most part, it's really focused. And I think that just helped me never feel like I was just lost at all.
Yeah, it like goes really deep on the things that it has. Alex, what's your lesson?
You mentioned Guy Pearce, Brian, and I think, I alluded to my experience in the first viewing when the sexual assault happened. I was like, whoa, this kind of came out of nowhere. But it kind of does it. Like on the second viewing, I think Guy Pearce's performance is doing so much work throughout the movie because there is that, he's got that perfect blend of, I am the patron who admires you and kind of like wants to possess you in this like positive way. Like I would like to bring you up in this world, and I admire you and I want to fund you as an artist. But there is this sinister dark side to that.
Yeah, just the article about him in the magazine that he gives him at the coffee shop. It's a man and his moderns, right? It's just like he's just collecting people, right? Or he's just like collecting Laszlo.
Yeah, and it's like it's a status thing. He gets this kind of special attention for his amazing library, and so I think his performance, watching it a second time, is so interesting to track. Just there's this really dark, not healthy underbelly to this relationship, and just the way Guy Pearce plays it and the way he embodies this character and kind of communicates in these like subtle ways his like not good relationship with his mom, not healthy boundaries there from what I can hear, probably some sexual orientation that is being suppressed with his wife who's just kind of out of the picture, who he left. So it's just, lots of, he's great at playing that kind of 50s man, where it's just like, we're in this time where so much has to be unsaid or repressed, and it's kind of curdled and become ugly inside of him. And so, just so many of the performances, but I think his especially, like tracking it throughout the movie, there's so many layers there. And it also helps him to embody the symbol. If he is symbolizing America, American power, that there's a corruption in there. There's these, sick parts of it that are messed up and wrong. But this outward generosity and wealth, and like, I want to fund, the artist. And so he embodies both metaphorically and just like in a character motivation way, all these layers. And so anyway, Guy Pearce is really good in this movie is my lesson, I guess. Both metaphorically and just as a believable character.
Yeah.
Real quick, I remembered it was Oppenheimer.
That's it. Yeah.
The Wikipedia, and I know I mentioned this on the episode.
Right.
The Wikipedia like cast list, which is generally it's not the entire cast, but it's generally like, here are the people you should know who they are.
Characters.
Right.
Yeah.
Is 60. And this movie, which is 30 minutes longer, is 14, and I barely remember like 4 of them.
That's such a good contrast.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, I
feel so
really
gratified.
understand all these characters in The Brutalist. I couldn't name half of those people or what they were doing, what their job was, or
I want to call it Joe Alwyn.
Alwyn, yeah.
Oh God,
who plays Harry, his
so
son,
perfectly cast. Yeah.
Yeah, and in that moment, when he's after the accusation with Van Buren, his father, like the unraveling that's happening on him, like you can see all those things that you were talking about, Alec, like all this repression, just like truly unraveling. It feels like, and it's
and what like horrible things have happened in that family,
it's very disturbing.
What are the bad family secrets that are now kind of being revealed here?
Yeah, speaking of the subtext, there's that weird moment because he and his sister are twins, right? Where there's that weird moment during dinner, like Christmas, where he puts his hand on her shoulder and she like smacks it away.
Oh yeah.
And I was like,
and I think there's even something interesting about when everybody's freaking out after Elizabeth comes and accuses Harrison of rape. Like, I think the sister actually looks at Harry and says, "What did you do?" Or I think there's a moment where it's like she's actually like Harry's the one that in her mind would be a rapist. So just
and there's the implication there
that he already did it. With
Sophia.
Yeah.
Right. But
Yes.
Anyway, not great things happening in that family.
Subtext.
Good times.
Succession and The Brutalist, we'll add that to the list of like shows set in the modern world after people saw Game of Thrones. Just feels like, what if Game of Thrones happened in real life?
Anyway, Trisha, what's your lesson?
Sorry, I was just going to quickly say this reminds me of our conversation about Chinatown, because we were talking about what incest represents like psychologically, like in film or like in ideology, about how like only the deepest of corruption, right? Like kind of that idea of socially most people would protect their families even if they're willing to harm other people. But people who look at their families and decide to harm them specifically represent to us in fiction a deep, deep, deep core level of corruption. And it feels like this is drawing on that literary tradition of what this kind of like sexual perversion and rottenness represents.
Yeah, the Van Buren family feels very literary. Yeah,
they do, for sure.
The last little thing I'll add is that I had read something with Joe Alwyn where he was asked in an interview if the reason Harry is so violent towards Elizabeth is it because he immediately recognizes the accusation of maybe Harrison had done similar things to his kids, right? And he said, I didn't read it that way and we didn't play it that way, but at the same time he's like, I don't disagree with that as a way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about the opening. We've kind of touched on it already, but I was thinking about, again, the symbols as they begin to be sprinkled into the movie. And we sometimes talk about how movies teach you how to watch them. And the one that I've highlighted before in this conversation is the upside down Statue of Liberty, which is not an accident. But then also when he's first talking to Attila and, he's saying like, oh, we're Catholic, Audrey's Catholic, we're both Catholic, right? Like right away, I'm like, oh, that is symbolism, right? That's metaphor. We're really talking about the way that Attila has like subsumed his culture and like given up his heritage to become like assimilated and Americanized. And so I do think, I've been critical somewhat throughout this episode about like the more on the nose symbols, but I think the ones that are sprinkled early on are really interesting and go a long way towards helping you kind of get onto that metaphorical page with it. It's very readable in the text, and it's not even really subtext because they comment on it in dialogue, but Elizabeth can't walk for most of this movie. And then when she stands up to make the accusation, she stands up to make the accusation. Again, there's very real, deliberate thought about the different levels of meaning here that are being expressed early, like throughout, right? The thing with Gordon and his son, right? Those characters are symbolizing a different experience, not an immigrant experience in the United States, but a very real lived experience of people who are also getting to experience firsthand the rottenness of the American dream. And so I just think that there's the like character web and the symbolism is all really thoughtfully put together. And pretty much in every scene, it feels like there's a clear understanding of what's going on thematically. When it's subtle and when it isn't, it is at least there.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that kind of ties into my lesson as a director, as a storyteller, spending time thinking about how you want to make the audience feel. And there's so many tools at your disposal to manipulate how the audience feels. And if you know what the scene means, then that can start to guide you toward, well, here's how I want people to feel about what it means. And I think what is annoying to me sometimes about experimentally film is when the storytellers only care about, I'm going to make you feel weird things, but like it's maybe not in service of the theme or the story. It's just like, look what I made you feel while you were watching a movie. And what's so impressive to me about this movie is that it's telling the story. It knows its story. It knows what its story is about in every moment. It knows what it means in every moment. And it's using all the tools at its disposal to make you feel a way about what's happening. So like acting style, camera framing, cinematography, sound, music, all those things are being done in a, I would say, unconventional way, at least a lot of the time, to make you feel and think about like what's happening in just a really unique way. And I think that's why this movie feels kind of like miraculous and like impossible, because like to do that intentionally is so hard. And this movie does it like start to finish and like doesn't stumble essentially while executing it. And I don't know. Yeah, for some reason in the last several weeks I've had this like a weird like anger at the kind of idea of like making a movie is like get a camera and I point it at people that do stuff and I try to make the lighting look pretty and look, I made a movie. And I don't know what. Maybe
Who's
I've been
projecting that idea?
I've probably been on
an anger at.
Well, I think I've probably been on the cinematography subreddit too much, and there's a lot of like aspiring filmmakers that are asking like all the wrong questions and like paying attention to all the wrong things, which is triggering anger at young Michael, who was also that. Anyway, and so it's cool to have examples of films to study that are using the tools, the cinematic language in some traditional, some novel ways, while also delivering on all the core things needed to build a solid foundation to just deliver a film experience that for almost 4 hours is engaging and interesting and not slow and not boring and all these things that we've been talking about. This is kind of just a miraculous movie. And so I think there's a lot of things to study about it. And that's the thing that I'm very impressed by.
I was listening to Mark Maron interview the director, and Mark Maron essentially said this movie has big dick energy. Like it just, it's just like this movie is like, boom, I am here and I am incredibly impressive. Like, yeah,
there's this like confidence, but like not a showiness too. Like I feel like that can, to me anyway, that's something that can often happen, is like getting high off your own supply almost, of like, look at how cool and weird I am when I'm making this movie. And this movie doesn't feel like it is.
Except for the closing credits, which are diagonal.
I mean, I think it is showy, but it like earns it. And like it's like he's good enough that
it knows when to be showy.
Yeah. I don't know. It's showy with class and with taste, and
it never feels showy and a like, look at me, look at how cool my long take was, everybody. Like it feels like it's always doing something and it's impressive and showy on top of the fact that it's executing the right thing.
Yeah, the long take is riveting because of the content and the performances. Is not just like, oh wow, it's a long take.
Right.
Yeah. One thing I will say is that I'm excited to see more from this filmmaker. Like, I wonder if 5-10 years from now, we will be sitting here talking about Brady Corbet's new movies and just being like really thrilled. Already, this is such an accomplishment, but I do wonder where he's going from here. So
he said in that same interview that his next movie will primarily take place in the 70s. So
great.
Yeah.
I'm here for that. Yeah. Well, I want to hear what else you guys have been watching. Before we do that, reminder that next week we'll be back with Chicago over on the Beyond the Screenplay Patreon. That'll be a Patreon exclusive episode. Very excited to revisit that movie 20 some years later. It's been a long time, but I have fond memories. I've been humming the Cell Block Tango to myself a lot. But what else have you guys been watching recently? Alex, what have you been watching recently?
So this past weekend, I watched the movie Flow, which is an animated movie from Latvia. And I just had kept hearing like it's this really lovely, kind of very unique animation experience. And it's really, it's an experience. It in a lot of ways. So it's basically about a cat in this kind of, I don't know, just strange magical world where there's kind of a great flood happening. And so it's this cat and a lot of other different animals like on a boat, like on their way to a destination. Totally no words, just all sounds and visuals and music. But like the animation is taking such care to capture the essence of these animals and all their cat things and their dog things and their bird things. And it's very sweet, but also kind of has this melancholy to it. And there's this kind of feeling of like the world is ending and, you know, it's like something's being lost and going away, but these kind of sweet animals are like surviving together. And it reminded me of some beautiful kind of artistic video games I've played. There's a company that made a game called Journey, which is essentially just this very gorgeously rendered, wordless expression of the hero's journey, where it's just kind of this character going on the ups and downs of a hero's journey through gameplay until they reach the peak at the end, and then kind of return home. And that's very much what this felt like, which is just a wordless, bare bones hero journey, but very beautiful and melancholy and kind of a very specific type of computer animation. So if you want to just like sit for 90 minutes in a beautiful, melancholy animal world and go on a wordless hero's journey, Flow is for you.
Also,
Nice.
the video game Stray is kind of like what you're talking about, but you're a cat.
Yeah, and it was really interesting because Flow did make me feel like there's this convergence happening of video game cinematic language and kind of the way a lot of, you know, think about God of War or games that have kind of this long take camera that kind of moves through space and with the characters. Very much that language was being used in this movie. And so I was feeling almost like this was a blend of traditional animated film, but also kind of video game language. So yeah, just it was cool to see that convergence happening as well.
Interesting.
Joshua, what have you been watching recently?
If you like historical, slow-moving dramas with lots of subtext, I have a great movie for you from last year called Small Things Like These, which is a film starring Cillian Murphy, directed by Tim Milance, I want to say, is also with a great performance by Emily Watson. I really enjoyed this movie. Without spoiling too much, it's a drama set in Ireland in this very small town, and it's about Cillian Murphy and his family. His daughters go to the local Catholic school, but it's like kind of they're a working class family, and the school's a little bit like a private sort of posh school. And there's sort of an implication that Cillian Murphy is hiding part of his past, or there's a little bit of a mystery around what's really going on in the town. And if you know anything about the Magdalene Laundries, it turns out to be a movie about the Magdalene Laundries, which I already did know a decent amount about, which is a great historical injustice that occurred and happened to a lot of women over a long period of time. So anyway, I thought it was really interesting and very well done. I liked Cillian Murphy more in this movie than I've liked him in anything in a really long time.
Wow.
I really, really liked his performance in this. And
He's very
the direction,
quiet and
he's
understated. Yeah.
very quiet. Again, subtext. So much subtext, but he's doing wonderful work. And the direction's really great also. There's no doubt it's slow moving and was definitely like a low budget film, but I really enjoyed it. Small Things Like These.
Nice.
Agreed, but if you only watch one movie about the Magdalene Laundries, I recommend The Magdalene Sisters, which is a beautiful movie.
Nice. I haven't seen that one.
Nice. Ryan, what have you been watching recently?
Well, if you like segues and you like 2024 films about a young man who immigrates to America to pursue his dreams and ends up meeting an overbearing English benefactor who can either make their dreams come true or be their worst nightmare. I almost made it through. I couldn't even make it through that part. I watched Problemista, which is written, directed by and starring Julio Torres. And yeah, he just like is trying to make it in New York. He wants to work for Hasbro and like he's like a toy inventor kind of thing. And then he meets Tilda Swinton, who is just like the most overbearing, like sending her food back and telling the waiter not to yell at her when he says they're out of something and like all this kind of thing. And you know, I kind of had it on my to watch list, and some of the reviews were sort of middling, and I was like, okay, maybe at some point. And then I put it on. I loved it. It just had like the right kind of energy for me. It has this like Michel Gondry, Wes Anderson kind of colorful, playful vibe to it. And yeah, it just like it literally like it'll go into like dream logic at some points. Like he's like on Craigslist, but then he's just suddenly like now in a like nebulous space, and there's just like a guy, this very strange looking person talking to him, and he's just like, you want to look at some feet or whatever. It's just like Craigslist is being represented by like some character in like a dreamland. And yeah, it just all really, really worked for me. So Problemista, really enjoyed it.
I night before last, saw Harry Potter and the Cursed Child at the Pantages, the play. Kind of random. It's, it's the truncated version of the Broadway show that came out, 8 years ago, I guess. And I'd heard that it was like spectacular and cool, and kind of went in not knowing what to expect. And the cool things about it were just the special effects of it, and this feeling that I think you could only get in like a live theater setting of like, oh, this is like magic. When they turn from this person into that person, that's magic. And so it was delightful in that way. And narratively, it was really interesting to look at. And obviously, it's truncated from the 4-hour, 2-day version or whatever it was originally.
2-day?
Yeah, you had to like reserve 2 days. You watch the first half on one day because that was 2 acts. Then you'd go back the next day and watch the second half of the story.
And people didn't like that?
In 2 acts. Some people really liked it, I think. But it was just, we've been talking about form and plays. And so it was interesting to see a play and see the kind of the midpoint curtain comes down that was really interesting and cool. And there was some interesting character stuff. But also just it felt like a really weird examination of what happens when you try to stretch an IP like to its limits and past its limits. Even if you do some things really well, it was just really fascinating to watch and think about it through that lens, and some of the mechanics used to hit all of the things that it felt like fan fiction for Harry Potter by the creator and some other people. So I don't know, it was a weird watch in 2025, but overall a fun night out. Good performers, good direction, good special effects.
Is everything just fanfic now?
Yes.
Really, is what it's feeling like.
Nobody can talk to me today. The James Bond news dropped today.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
And I'm in such a deep depression that I don't even know
how
where
can
to
there
start.
not be a broccoli in the opening credits?
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a really personal betrayal by the Broccoli's to me. But I'm still processing. Everyone please give me space in this time. I just need some space.
It'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen? This has been our conversation about The Brutalist. I want to say a big thank you, as always, to the patrons that make this show possible. If you want to become a patron and get access to next week's episode of Chicago, head over to the Beyond the Screenplay Patreon. The link for that is in the show notes. Thank you to our producer, Vince Major. Thank you to our editor, Mike Wuerth, and the whole Nebula Studios team. I'm Michael Tucker, and I'm joined today by Trisha Rand, Brian Bittner, and Alex Calleros. And we will see you in the next episode for Chicago.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.